Tomorrow, Pete Hegseth, in his infinite wisdom, has decided to visit the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Per his orders, the U.S. Naval Academy is apparently scrambling to get books out of the library before he gets there. Books like a biography of Jackie Robinson. That's got to be out of there, I guess, before Pete Hegseth gets to the Naval Academy because it so offends him. Because, you know, he's really focused on lethality.
It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. We just learned ahead of Pete Hegseth's trip to Annapolis that multiple displays highlighting the contributions of women graduates of the Naval Academy have been taken down or covered up, as in literally covered up, so that the Secretary of Defense won't have to be confronted by these stories. In particular, a display honoring the service of Jewish naval officers had every mention of women taken down or covered. We don't know if this display will be restored after Hegseth's visit, but the very fact that our military, compelled by Hegseth's and Trump's anti-DEI mandates, feels compelled to erase the contributions of women and minorities, it's a disgrace. One of the threads that I've been wanting to unravel is the connection between the performative masculinity of Pete Hegseth and what has gone wrong with American men more broadly. We know that our Secretary of Defense proudly displays his Christian nationalist tattoos, including a Crusader's cross, and that his main initiative at the Department of Defense is, for lack of a better description, making it manly again. MAGA influencers openly celebrate Pete Hegseth bringing toxic masculinity back into our military. This recent episode from Charlie Kirk is literally lauding the fact that toxic masculinity is back. And what has that chest-thumping bravado gotten us? The most incompetent national security team ever. Fist and fire emojis. You all know about Signalgate. We're certainly going to keep reporting on the fallout from that. But what I'm trying to understand is the mindset, the arrogance of someone like Pete Hegseth, which, by the way, masks an insecurity so deep that he apparently can't walk by a display case showing female heroes without being triggered. I want to know how Hegseth's overt Christian nationalism informs all of this. I think Angela Denker gets it. Yesterday, I shared part one of our conversation about her new book out this week titled Disciples of White Jesus. In part two, Angela dives into how right-wing evangelicalism feeds the worldview of those in Trump's orbit and stokes the flames of fanaticism to convince people like Pete Hegseth, who is a religious zealot, that America is engaged in a crusade to stop progress, like equal opportunities for women. The fact that Pete Hegseth wears his crusader values as a badge of pride, the crusader cross, the word infidel in Arabic tattooed on his skin, it gives you an appreciation of just how pervasive the extremist Christian nationalist ideology has become in Trump's inner circle. Angela Denker does a great job of explaining the role of right-wing churches in all of this. Here's part two of our conversation. You call out the faith community for not doing more to describe a positive version of masculinity, but it's worse than that. The indictment of the faith community includes advancing these grotesque versions of masculinity. How do they wrap that in Christianity? You almost have to ignore the entire New Testament to get away with that. When you're in these spaces talking to these pastors, what's their most convincing argument? I just don't get any of it.
Well, I mean, you're neglecting those few verses in Paul that tell women to sit down and be quiet.
Fair enough.
And that say that, those are their timeless truths. When we're looking at the New Testament, those are what you tend to hear over and over and over again, that the man is the head of the family. And it's really grounded, their idea of Christianity is really grounded in hierarchy. It's really not grounded, as you know, in the biblical text. It's not grounded, certainly in the Beatitudes or in the messages of Jesus, which is...
Well, that's the thing. It's the red letter text. Explain the red letter text for the uninitiated that you have to ignore to abide this worldview.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's why ultimately the book gets White Jesus in the title, because White Jesus, and it's really... when I look at both books that I've written, both Red State Christians, which was my first book, sort of a post-mortem of Christianity in the 2016 election. They're really interesting to be read as a 2-volume work in some ways, because we've made this transition in American politics and American Christianity from red state Christians, which is something I think you and I both understand. Maybe we grew up with a little bit, this sort of sense that America's the promised land, that the American military is fighting for democracy and freedom and Christianity. All of those things Trump leaned into in 2016. We are in a new place in 2024 where we've moved from red state Christians, honor the flag, support the troops, sort of lip service, of course, to this kind of argument from American Christians, to disciples of white Jesus. And white Jesus has now become the object of faith. And what I've really noticed recently too, and this certainly, we have to talk about the assassination attempts on Donald Trump as this time when he really took on this messianic mantle. And you start to hear a lot more conversation about Trump himself in the same breath as Jesus. And so we have white Jesus and Donald Trump. And if you look at iconography, imagery, the increasing amount of muscles that are starting to be shown on Jesus and on Donald Trump, the way they're depicted in a masculine sense, it's verging closer together, and it really crowds out the historical Jesus. Certainly the history of Jesus, that he was in the Middle East, he wasn't American, he was Jewish, all of these facts don't matter. And that's where we get back to the algorithm, because the algorithm does not care about facts. The algorithm does not care about truth or history. It just promotes extreme interest that keeps people tuned in and keeps them buying things.
Well, and this version of Jesus certainly doesn't account for what he actually said. That's the red letter text in the Bible I grew up with. His words were in red text, and that was sort of the basis for the understanding of his ministry. The rest was helpful, but that red letter text was the foundation, and you kind of have to ignore all of it to believe in a Jesus holding an AR-15. And those memes exist, right? And they're not ironic. I mean, there is a serious movement in Christian nationalism today that pairs Jesus with assault weapons.
Yeah. And that's the reason why the book starts out by talking about danger, because it's dangerous. And these weapons are dangerous towards others, and they're dangerous towards those who are wielding them themselves. And that violence and that danger is part and parcel both of this movement and of just authoritarianism writ large. Because when you're scared and you're worried about violence, you're much more susceptible to the promises of an authoritarian leader and willing to give up your rights to follow that leader.
You go deep into one particular example of how that danger actually affected the lives of real people in the community of Charleston. And one young white man in particular who was radicalized, whose father bought him a gun, and I'll let you finish the story, but it is, as someone who spent time in Charleston, whose my first daughter was born there, watching what happened to that city and knowing that it was almost inevitable given the cultural forces there, it still tore me apart.
Yeah. Well, and so the book is framed by narratives, and the beginning story of the book is that of Dylan Roof, the white supremacist mass shooter who went into Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, storied Black church history, and killed 9 worshipers there.
After sitting with them and looking them in the eye.
In Bible study. Yes. And what I was really struck by and what comes across in the book is just, I think it's heartbreaking to hear you talk about Charleston, your time there too, and to feel like there was this sense of inevitability. What I got too was this sense of interconnectedness, right? Which is what I wanted to emphasize in sort of going back to this story, both paying my respects at Mother Emanuel, and also going to the ELCA Lutheran Church where the shooter was brought up. And I happened to be there on All Saints Sunday when the congregation was remembering his dad who had just died. And so there's this, Southern city, rich sense of history, rich sense of legacy of racism and slavery. And I sat and talked with the shooter's pastor, because again, I wanted to tell this story because this isn't the stereotypical, evangelical megachurch you might think that breeds this radicalization. This is a small, mainline, relatively progressive congregation in South Carolina. And what his pastor talked about was this shared sense of shame, of guilt, of regret that so many white Christians carry and don't know what to do with because of the legacy of racism in our churches. And what he also brought up too was his grief that he had not only known the Roof family, but that he had also known Clementa Pinckney, who was the pastor from Mother Emanuel, who was killed in the shooting. And Clementa Pinckney had been at that church to prepare ashes for Ash Wednesday. So it's this reminder that as much in America we want to separate ourselves and say, well, these people have these problems and these people have these problems, but they're not my problems. We're all connected to particularly this issue of what's happening with white men and boys and what's happening in our churches.
Hey, it's Ken Harbaugh. Huge shout out to everyone who has supported this show via our Patreon page. If you want to weigh in with questions for upcoming guests or give us feedback on past guests or make sure you never miss an episode, click the link below. It's free to sign up. And if you're able to pitch in a few bucks a month, just know that we put every dollar back into the show. We do have another reporting trip to Ukraine coming up. Thanks for the help. Can you talk about Caleb and deradicalization? Give us some hope as we wrap up our conversation.
So we begin with this story in Charleston. We end with this story in Phoenix with Caleb. And Caleb shared with me his own journey that he brought up sort of conservative Texas Christianity, grew up in Arizona as well, and then joins a skinhead group. In his sort of cynicism about the church in general, becomes very involved in white supremacist ideology, violence, beatings. And then as he steps away from that group, his next stop is Pastor Mark Driscoll, who's one of sort of the famous purveyors of this masculine, violent Jesus. And he becomes sort of a Driscoll fanboy and becomes trained as a pastor in that version of Christianity, ends up pastoring a church in Phoenix, goes through the COVID pandemic, witnesses his fellow church members just prioritizing profit, prioritizing extreme politics over their well-being and lives. And he ends up today, he is a crusader and he calls himself a missionary to Christian nationalists, that he wants to work as hard as he can against the very kind of ideology that affected him as a young man, both as a skinhead and as a conservative Christian. So a really powerful story. And there's another kind of ending story as well that brings up a different side of what masculinity can look like in healing even after abuse. So I'm grateful for those stories, and I hope they help parents to kind of have different narratives that we can share with our kids about masculinity, about healing, about empathy, and care for one another.
Well, I want to end with your dedication at the beginning. I might choke up reading this as a parent. You write, to Jacob and Joshua, my love for you is deeper than the deepest well. When I grew worried or afraid or frustrated in telling these stories of boys and men, I drew water from my well of love for you, and my words became truer and more meaningful. I don't think I've ever read a better dedication. I think the dedication in my book was to my children, without whom this book would have been finished much sooner. Yours is better. Thank you so much, Angela. The book is Disciples of White Jesus, and it's out now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ken.
Can't get enough Meidas? Check out the Meidas Plus Substack for ad-free articles, reports, podcasts, daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, and more. Sign up for free now at MeidasPlus.com.